Okay, hello, hola. Welcome back to my very haphazard Spanish channel. I'm going to start and hopefully stick with a series on this channel where each month I focus in on either a region of Spain or a Spanish-speaking country and not only give a general history about the place, but also bring in some information about that region that relates to A-level topics in Spanish. And I'm going to do one video in English and then one video in Spanish, more so that you can test comprehension with the Spanish one, but truly understand the history and info with the English one. And so this will be the English one for the, as they call them in Spain, autonomous community of Asturias. So, Asturias is one of 4 autonomous communities along Spain's north coast in the heart of a region which is called España Verde, Green Spain, as it is the most verdant, luscious, rainfall-heavy part of Spain. The place is very mountainous. It includes northern Spain's tallest mountain, Torre del Cerredo, which is 2,600 meters tall. And whilst it's only got 1 million inhabitants, and so is 2% of Spain's population and area, it's still a very significant region for other historic reasons. Oviedo, right in the middle of the region, is its capital and has been for about 1,000 years. However, it's a third of the size of their biggest city, Gijón, on the coast, which is their main, of course, port and industrial hub. So the region now known as Asturias was first inhabited by humans over 20,000 years ago, and you can still find cave paintings from that era in a cave called Tito Bustillo. However, of sort of modern significance, the Celts first came into the Iberian Peninsula just over 3,000 years ago, followed by the Romans and of course the Visigoths, who pretty much created modern day Spain. However, they didn't heavily populate the area, although of course with speaking Spanish they've heavily culturally influenced the area. But genetically, Asturias is still pretty Celtic. A Celtic tribe called the Astures were the specific custodians of the area, which is obviously where its name Asturias comes from. The main reasons for this are the incredibly narrow passes and very tall mountains of the Cantabrian range that barrier the region from the rest of Spain. So no big cities developed of the time. However, notable large landowning families did start to be established in the area. So then came along the 7th century, and with it the Umayyad Caliphate, taken over almost all of Spain, but not Asturias. And this is where Asturias gets its most fame from. This was the era of its most famous resident, Pelagius, or as they call him in Spanish, Pelayo. Whether he was a Visigoth refugee or a native Celtic Asturian, no one is sure, but what we do know is that he had a vigour that was heavily against the Caliphate, and in 718, or maybe a different year, but most sources say 718, he led an army through a very narrow pass in a town in eastern Asturias called Covadonga and managed to overwhelm the competing Muslim army. An army of over 100,000, and this was the start of Spain's reconquista. And with this victory, Pelagius started a little kingdom in Asturias. At Pelayo's death, his son Fafila took over, and then, as monarchies work, his grandson Alfonso took the throne at Fafila's passing, and Alfonso was the one to really accelerate the Reconquista. Under his reign, they managed to take over Leon and Galicia, and this was the real motioning of the Reconquista. They set up an official capital at Covadonga, which still has an abbey to this day, but very quickly this was moved to what has stayed as the capital. It was moved to Oviedo, probably due to the fact that it's in one of the few flat areas of Asturias. And as the Reconquista gained further and further more territory, Asturias, despite playing the initial role, became just another region of Spain again. However, it does hold the distinction of being a principality in that the heirs to the Spanish throne are called the Prince and Princess of Asturias because of this initial role in the Reconquista. So, with lots of tall mountains near the sea, Asturias has a lot of fast-flowing short rivers, 4 of them being the Nalón, the Sella, the Caudal, and the Narcea. The valleys of 2 of them, the Nalón and Caudal, include some of Spain's biggest coal deposits. Like pretty much everywhere pre-industrial, Asturias was typical agrarian and being by the sea. Fishing and farming were the main industries. But with this coal, it took off mainly in the 1830s and led to a region becoming an economic powerhouse. It was able to divert into steel manufacturing, and as a result, especially during the 70s and 80s, after the fall of Franco, Asturias became one of the most prosperous regions of Spain because of how much industry and how much raw material they could export. And the region had lots of internal migration from very poor, still agrarian regions, such as the one directly south of it, the ginormous Castilla y León. But with this comes utterly horrendous pollution. Next to Gijón is the ammonia steel plant, and it is one of the biggest polluters in Spain. Gijón famously has pollution levels at times higher than Madrid or Barcelona. This is despite Gijón being a 20th the size of Madrid and also being by the sea, so having a sea wind to sweep everything away, and Madrid being in this desert bowl where all the heat and pollution can just sit. And another thing all this heavy industry led to was Asturias sort of being Spain's capital to workers' rights and workers' protests. If you're British, you'll find it's quite similar with South Wales. It's got lots of mountains, lots of short, fast-flowing rivers, loads of coal deposits, so lots of industry and wiggly railways. And one of the biggest protests that Asturias had was in 1934. These were ginormous protests against policies that the miners saw were to economically suffocate them, and this was from a government led by a Christian Conservative party called CEDA. And these miners, it turned into this like socialist workers' revolution where they took control of the regional government and managed to execute quite a few of the high-ranking officials in the process. But as all revolutions usually do, it ended with the military taking over. With us being by the sea, it was the Navy. But this was all just a prelude. If we know our history, 1934 is 2 years before 1936, when the whole Spanish Civil War began, and in 1937, Asturias was unfortunately captured by the fascists, by Franco. And like many small regions in Spain, Asturias has a native language, Asturian. It is also a Western Ibero-Romance language, so it is pretty similar to Spanish. However, it doesn't have any proper official status like Catalan or Basque, despite the fact around 100,000 people, so 10% of Asturias's population, are native speakers, and 500,000, so around half the Asturian population, have knowledge of it and can speak it as a second language. But as someone who cares about minority languages, I hope it gets official status soon, and I hope its education increases so that it lives. So that was a little background to the region of Asturias, a small slither along the coast. My next video will be this one, but in Spanish. So I'll see you for that. So my original plan was to film this video again in Spanish, but after filming it twice and both times needing to look at my script and just looking down at my laptop kind of like this, looking really, really boring, realised that wasn't going to work. I will have the Spanish script with little pointers pointing to interesting grammatical points down below and in a PDF, and I may refilm it in sort of an ASMR style because I feel like it's the only way I'm going to make it watchable, because you won't need to watch me reading a script, you'll just be listening going off to bed, hopefully. So yeah, hopefully that'll work. Also, there's quite a few videos in ASMR style about Asturias. Anyway, that's been Asturias. Quizás en el futuro se puede escuchar este video en español.